Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava, Kamma, Daf, Mem, Chet. Before we start, I just want to point out that the Hebrew date is Chet B'Tevet, which is an important date in Daf Yomi because 4 years ago on that day, we started the new cycle. So that means for anyone learning from the beginning, it is the 4-year mark on the Hebrew calendar. Perhaps by the time we get to the date on the English calendar, January 5th, we'll do something a little more celebratory. But right now, it's just good to note that it's been 4 years on the Hebrew calendar. And for those who've been learning already more than one cycle, if you're in the second cycle, that means 11 and a half years you've been learning Daf Yomi. So kol hakavod to all of you who've been learning and have managed through these 4 years, or 11 and a half. Right? These last 4 years in particular, we've gone through a lot of different things together. So it's nice to look back and say, wow, look where we've come. Today's daf is sponsored by Shiur Stern in loving memory of her grandmother, Esther Davis, on her yahrzeit. May she watch over her namesakes and continue to be a melitzat yosher for her family and all of Klal Yisrael. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran Zoom family for the continued, full, and speedy recovery of Netanel Yaakov ben Yehudit Sarah, who bravely and heroically defends Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. Hashem oz b'toch shar chalei Yisrael. Hashem oz l'amo yiten. Hashem ibarech et amo b'shalom. Okay, we're going to start with the question of the Gemara, and I'm going to kind of clarify it a little better than yesterday. Ibayalihu. We're about 6 lines from the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud. The Gemara asked, we had this idea that, again, going back to Ruth and Naomi, Ruth brings something into Naomi's courtyard. And then we had a debate between the rabbis, Tana Kamma, and Rebbe about whether if Naomi says, you're allowed to bring this into my field, whether it be, right, pots, whether it be fruits, whether it be an animal, basically, she says you're allowed to bring it in. What did she mean? The rabbis say she meant, I'll accept responsibility for it. Rebbe said, which means I'll accept responsibility. Now, that's going to be the question. What kind of responsibility does she accept? We'll get to that in a minute. According to Rebbe, she doesn't accept responsibility. She just says, yeah, you can bring it in here, but she wasn't saying, I'm going to be responsible for it. Why would she do that? But if Naomi specifically says, and I will be responsible for it, by the way, we're going to end with a case like this at the end of today's daf. A lot of today's daf is going to circle back to things earlier in the daf. We're going to have a lot of connections. Different sugyot that all seem to be relating to similar things. So if she says, but I will watch it, then she accepts responsibility. Now, in both the cases, the rabbis, whether it was just automatic or Rebbe where it was explicit, either which way Naomi says, I will watch your, let's just call it the pot. Okay, I will watch your pots. So now the question is, when she accepts responsibility, either automatically according to the rabbis or according to Rebbe, according to Rebbe explicitly, what type of responsibility? Now the question here is a little more directed than I said yesterday. Does Naomi accept responsibility for any damage her animals cause? Now, if you remember, that was what the Mishna said. If Naomi's shor gored Ruth's ox, let's say, right? Her ox gores Ruth's ox, then Naomi's going to be responsible, or her dog bites the ox, right? She'll be responsible for damages. Is that all the damages she's responsible for? Or is Naomi saying to Ruth, listen, your animal's now in my courtyard. I will protect your animal from anything, even from someone else's random animal that trespasses in my territory, okay? That she's basically saying your animal's protected by me for outside damages as well, okay? Ones that come from other people. That's why I want to specifically the question here is the liability of Naomi for damages that someone else causes to Ruth's animal while it's in Naomi's domain, or whether it's her animal or her kelim, it doesn't matter. Her food could be any of those. That's the question. So to answer the question, we're going to bring 2 sources, and we're going to do the exact same thing with both sources. We're going to assume the first time we read it that it means something, and then we're going to reject that meaning and explain it means something else, which is going to basically, in the end, say, it's possible this gives an answer to our question, but it's definitely possible to read that source that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. And then we don't really end up with an answer to the question. Tashma, let's learn from here. Tanya Rav Yehuda bar Simon ben Nizakin debate Karna. Karna was a chacham that had, it was like parallel to Rav Shmuel. There was Karna, and Karna had his own book of Braitot. So in his Braitot of Nizikin, he had the following source. Okay, if Ruth brings in fruits into Naomi's field without permission, and Yael's shor comes out of nowhere, comes into Naomi's field, damages, right, and eats her fruits, patul, she's exempt. Now, this is if Ruth had no permission to be in Naomi's, right? Ruth had no permission to bring her fruits, Yael, the animal, comes in and eats her fruits, she's exempt. But if Ruth had permission to bring her shor into Naomi's field, chayav, then she's liable. Now, who's liable? We don't know. So the first assumption is man patur man chayav, who's exempt and who's liable for damages here. La patur ba'al chatzer v'chayav ba'al chatzer. Okay, now, if Ruth brings her stuff into Naomi's field without permission, right, the simple reading would be, Ruth had no right to be there. Naomi took upon no responsibility, and therefore she's exempt if Yael's ox comes in and eats the fruits. But if Naomi gave her permission, then Naomi accepted responsibility to protect. And therefore, if Ruth's fruits get eaten, Naomi will have to pay. And that would give us an answer to our question. She is liable. But the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Amrei lo. Patur ba'ala shol v'chayav ba'ala shol. It's Yael who we're talking about. Her animal was the one who ate. Of course, when we talk about exempt or liable, we're talking about, is Yael exempt or is Yael liable? Now that sounds like a good logic, because in the end, right, when we're going to make her liable, her ox ate the fruits. Of course, she should compensate Ruth. But what doesn't make sense? What should it matter to Yael whether Ruth was, and the Breita sets it up that whether Yael is going to be liable or not is all dependent on whether Ruth had permission to bring her fruits into Naomi's field. What does that have to do with Yael? Whether she had permission to bring to Naomi's field. So that's what the Gemara is going to say. Now, Ibala Shul, my birashuv and my shalom birashut. What does that have to do with anything? Why is there this distinction? She had permission, she didn't have permission. That has absolutely nothing to do with Yael. So that's a weakness with that approach. To which the Gemara resolves that by saying, no, it makes all the difference. Amrei, and now we're going to go back to something we learned in the beginning of the Masechet. Birashut haGelili. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about damages of eating. What is eating? Shame, right? So Yael's animal eats Ruth's fruits. That's shame. Now, if you remember, there's a distinction, shame in the property of the one who is damaged, which is not the case here. Well, first glance, it's not the case, which is Yael's animal ate Ruth's fruits in Naomi's field. Okay, but this is where the reshut and lo reshut is going to come into play. So shame, you're liable if you eat someone's fruits in their own field. If you eat them in the public domain, right, or in someone else's field, you're actually not liable if it's not their field. So now this is where reshut and lo reshut comes into play. Amrei, they said to answer this question, bereshut, havi l'shem bereshut anizak. When Naomi gives permission to Ruth to leave her fruits there, Ruth becomes a partner to the land, because the land now, Ruth has rights to the land to leave her stuff there. So it's as if that Yael is eating the fruits of Ruth in Ruth's property, because Ruth becomes a partner in the field. B'shem bereshut anizak chayevet. In that kind of case, you'd be liable for damages. If it's shalom bereshut, right, we're giving the case in the opposite order that they brought them in. But if in case number one, where she came in without permission, havi l'shem bereshut harabim. Okay, relatively speaking, this is like reshut harabim, because for Ruth has no rights to be there. So from Yael and Ruth's perspective, Yael's ox is eating fruits in the public domain. And we said that is permitted, right? You're not liable damages there. But B'shem bereshut harabim is p'tura. And therefore, that's why in the end, you can explain. Now, again, you can explain it the first way, but you can also explain that the exempt and the yes obligated, not obligated is all talking about Yael, has nothing to do with Naomi, and it doesn't teach us anything about responsibility of Naomi for damages, because in this case, there's someone who's more responsible than her. And this is something that came up a lot until now. It's going to keep coming up about, it could be that Naomi might have a responsibility. We don't know. But Yael, in this case, is more responsible because her shor is the one who ate it. So we're going to put it in her domain rather than Naomi's, even though maybe without, right, if there wasn't someone else, right, well, the truth is the whole case is someone else. So I guess that would give you the answer that no. So it's really unclear, because we could read it both ways. Either Naomi is responsible or she isn't responsible. Tashma. Second source, which is going to be similar, except it's not going to be Shane, and we won't be able to answer the same answer we answered before. Because if it's not Shane, then you don't have that whole distinction, reshut anizak, reshut harabim. So Tashma, shoro lechatzer balabayit. This time Ruth brings in an ox in this source. Shelo bereshut, again, without permission, into Naomi's field. Uba shor mimakom acher. And now Yael's ox comes into Naomi's domain. Unigacho, and gores Ruth's ox and causes damage. Patur, since Ruth had no permission to be there, she's exempt. Again, who's she? We don't know, Naomi or Yael. Ve'im yichnis bereshut, if she had permission to bring the shor in, she'd be chayav. Okay, whoever it is would be chayevet. Okay, we don't know which one, but we're going to see. So man patur man chayav. The first reading is exactly how we read the other source. La patur ba'al chatzer v'chayav ba'al chatzel. In which case, the patur and chayav is all about Naomi, and the whole difference is, did she let her or did she not let her come in? If she didn't let her come in, then she didn't assume any responsibility. If she did let her come in, she assumed responsibility even for outside predators, right? This shor that comes in from somebody else. To which they say lo, patur, again, like we said before, but we're going to have to explain how we can do it because we can't say shane and there's a difference between Rishud Arabim, Rishud Nizak, because it's Karen. Karen, what do we always say? You're liable in private, you're liable in public. It doesn't make a difference. So, lo, patur ba'al shor, v'chayav ba'al shor. So the responsibility is all about Yael. Is the El responsible or is she not? So again, what does it matter? What does it anything have to do with Yael, whether Ruth had permission to be there from Naomi or didn't have permission from Naomi? What would that have to do with Yael's ox goring? Amre hamane Rabbi Tarfon. Now, I said something that's not exactly true. While generally we don't distinguish Karen between private and public domain, Rabbi Tarfon had a unique approach that we do. If you remember, what's his approach? Now, he doesn't have it like Shane, where liable and not liable at all, but which fits in with patur and chayav. But what does Rabbi Tarfon say? Da'amal mishunech keren b'chatzar hanizak nezek shalem meshalem. Rabbi Tarfon says, if you do keren, which are atypical damages, even though normally you only have to pay half damages if it's a short time, right? Hasn't done it yet 3 times because it's unexpected, and therefore we don't make you pay full damages. But if you did it in the domain of the person whose property it was, okay, meaning Yael comes into, let's say, Naomi's property and gores Naomi's ox, well, then she's going to have to pay full damages. If she does it outside in the public domain, she'll also be obligated, but only half damages. So now we're going to explain patur and chayav is patur from full damages, but has to pay half damages. Okay, and chayav is going to be pays full damages. And now you're going to see how it goes. Now it's going to be actually really parallel to what we did in the previous section. Birishut, if Naomi allows Ruth to come in, then haGelili chatzar nizak, haGelili keren b'chatzar nizak, u'mishalem nezek shalem. At that point, Ruth becomes a partner in the property of Naomi. And because she becomes a partner in the property of Naomi, because she's allowed to leave her shor there, that gives her, again, it doesn't really mean she has property rights, but it means she's enough to be considered that this is her own domain for this purpose. Then what happens? Then we're going to say that when Yael's ox gores Ruth's ox in Naomi's domain, it's really like it's in Ruth's domain. And according to Rabbi Tarfon, you'd have to pay full damages. So chayav means you pay full damages. Shelo bereshut, well, if it's shelo bereshut, then Ruth's ox is in someone else's property. That's, relatively speaking, that's reshut harabim. And that's keren, haGelili keren bereshut harabim. And again, when the Braita says patur, what they mean is exempt from full damages, but does still have to pay half. Now, this is an interesting thing to say that patur really means exempt from full damages, but does have to pay something. And it might remind you of Masechet Shabbat, if you remember. Masechet Shabbat, we had a lot of times where someone is patur, what it really meant is patur of alasukun. Now, it's not the same thing. There, what it really meant is you're exempt from by Torah law, but you're liable in rabbinic law. It's not the same distinction here, but again, you could say you're exempt from full, you're liable for half. So it's a kind of concept of saying patur doesn't really mean you're totally exempt. Okay, but it means you're exempt from the main halacha of full damages. So those were 2 different sources that we tried to bring to answer our question. Does Naomi assume full responsibility for when she does assume responsibility does Naomi assume responsibility for Ruth's ox when she says, bring it in, and either says, and I'll accept responsibility, or we assume she does. Does she accept responsibility for damage from other people's stuff in her own territory? And that's a debate. Okay, we're not clear about it. Or not a debate, it's just we don't really have an answer. Okay, we brought 2 sources, but neither really helped us. Because it could be explained as giving us an answer, it could be explained as no. Now we're going to have a story. Okay, what this is going to relate to, by the way, is something else. We ended yesterday, before we got to this question, with Rav. What did Rav say? In the case where Ruth brings her ox into Naomi's domain, and then, Ruth brings her fruits into Naomi's domain, and then the animal slips on the fruits, right? Or gets damaged by the fruits. And came Rav and said, it has to be slipped. It can't be the animal died from eating the fruits and the fruits, poisoned the animal somehow and caused the animal's death. Because Ruth can say, what were you doing What were Naomi's animals doing eating my fruits? Even if Ruth doesn't have permission to be there, she still has a claim saying, what were your animals doing eating my fruits? So now we have a story, similar story, or maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We're going to see where the halacha seems to be different. So there was a woman, she goes to bake in somebody's house. Now, this was very common. People had been usually outside. They had their ovens outdoors, and people would use them all the time because not everybody owned an oven. So she goes into somebody's house. They don't say whether it's b'reshut or lo b'reshut, but we assume later that it's b'reshut because try to imagine, right? No, most people don't go into other people's houses and use their ovens without asking permission, even if it's outside the house. But she had b'reshut, let's assume. But right now we don't know that. Comes a male goat, a taish, eats the dough, chavil umet, and the animal dies from it. So again, this woman is like Ruth, brings in dough to go bake it in Naomi's oven, and Naomi's animal eats it and dies. Lema, now, chayve Rava l'shalum t'mei barcha. Now, according to Rav, would you be liable or not? No. Rav would say, why was your animal eating my food? Ruth could say, no, why is your animal eating my food? So now, again, we're going to talk about maybe this difference, but lo b'reshut and why that should affect things. But right now, we don't talk about that. It just seems to be Rava was mechayev, and the Gemara says, lema pliga de Rav. Is it possible he disagrees with Rav? Like they have a hard time imagining that. But could it be that Rava disagrees with Rav and doesn't think that she has a claim to Amar Rav, Havyalah Shalo Tochal, right? Rav said, Ruth can have a claim and say, what was your animal doing? Eating my stuff. I'm not going to pay for that. Amre, so they say, no. Those two cases are different. And if you have the study guide in front of you, you'll see that we're going to have a distinction between three cases in the end. Okay, first they're going to bring this distinction, then they're going to question the way we explained our case based on another similar case to that, and then try to distinguish. Amre, hachi hashta, hatam shelo b'reshut, lo kabil aleinati Ruth. Now they're going to say something very interesting. There, Ruth didn't have permission to come into Naomi's field. In the case of Rav, right? She brings in her fruits without any permission. So if she brought them in without permission, clearly lo kabil aleinati Ruth. Clearly, Ruth didn't say, I'm accepting responsibility for any damage my fruits cause, because she wasn't permitted to go in there. So of course she wasn't. There's an assumption here that if she's permitted, perhaps she's saying, well, thanks for letting me bring my stuff in. I'll make sure that nothing happens, that no damage is caused. But if she goes in without any permission, then there's obviously no agreement between her and Naomi. So of course she wasn't accepting any responsibility for damages. And therefore, we're going to say if she didn't accept responsibility for damages, then she's not liable. But hacha b'reshut. Here she went in with permission. Ruth goes in to borrow Naomi's oven. She's basically saying, thanks for letting me use your oven, and I'm going to make sure to protect my dough from your animal. And in this case, she didn't, so she'll have to pay. Now the Gemara wants to know, wait a minute. If any time Ruth goes in with permission, Naomi's going to take she's going to take responsibility for any damage caused to Naomi's animals, but that disagrees with the source we saw already. Mishna mehaisha shenechnisa litchon chitim etzel balabayit shelo b'reshut. We saw this on yesterday's daf. There's a woman who goes in to grind, another thing they didn't all have, millstones. So she goes to grind her wheat to make flour at her next door neighbors. Right, it doesn't matter, next door neighbors, I'm saying next door neighbors, but etzel balabayit shelo b'reshut. Now in this case, she goes without permission. If the animal eats it, then they're exempt. But, right, in other words, if the animal destroys all of Ruth's grains and eats them all, so Naomi, right, if let's say it's Naomi's house, Naomi doesn't have to pay damages because Ruth came in without permission. Now, we had a whole debate about this, what im huska is, but let's say we understand it the way the original meaning meant, which means if Naomi's animal eats it and is damaged by it, then Ruth has to pay. Now, why does Ruth have to pay in this case? She has to pay damages because she came in without any permission. But now what's our case? Our case is with permission. And what do we say? When you go in with permission, you're obviously accepting responsibility. Ruth is saying, if your animal eats my stuff, I'll take responsibility. And that's why Rava made them obligated. But in this case, It's specifically because Ruth went in without permission that she's going to be liable for damages if the animal eats it. Ha-bireshut patur. But it sounds like if she were to have permission to go in, she wouldn't be liable for damages the animal eats. So this nice distinction you set up, not with permission, you actually, right, will be exempt. With permission, you'll be liable, doesn't fit in with this case. This case seems to be with permission, you're actually going to be exempt. So now we have to figure out what's the distinction between going in to bake your food, and this is going to teach you a little bit about the reality of their time, possibly, or possibly it's just an answer the Gemara gives, right? It's unclear whether it's steeped in reality or just a theory, but in order to resolve this contradiction, we're going to distinguish between the level of responsibility that Ruth assumes for her items. Okay, now again, both cases we're going to say, let's just review. When Ruth comes in to bake her dough, Rava makes her liable. When Ruth comes in to grind her wheat and the animal eats it and dies, right? Both cases, the animal eats it and dies. We're going to say, according to what we saw in the Braita yesterday, she's not going to be liable. So why would there be a distinction between her acceptance of responsibility in a case of the grains and her acceptance of responsibility in the case of the dough? So what's the difference? Well, Amre litonchitim, kevan, and it's all going to be based on tzniut, which is interesting. Kevan de lo bayat tzniut amidi. Now, when you grind in a millstone, it's not an unsanua activity. It's not an immodest activity, which means what? What's the relevance? Well, imagine Ruth goes into now, let's say Naomi's field. Naomi has a husband. So when she goes into Naomi's field, and let's say Naomi's husband gives her permission, well, Naomi's husband doesn't need to go disappear because Ruth is doing some immodest act. So therefore, lo bayim misalkem rabata de chatzer nafshayu. He, the owner of the house, Naomi's husband, doesn't need to go running and hiding away somewhere and saying, oh, this woman's in my garden, I better go somewhere else because she's doing something immodest and I want to give her privacy. And therefore, we assume he's going to stick around. And therefore, again, this goes back to our seesaw of who is more responsible than who. In that case, if he's around, well, then, ale didi ramya nitiruta. And this goes back to what we said in the beginning. If he gave her permission to come in, then he's going to stick around. It's his responsibility. He lets her in. And he's basically saying, I'll make sure no damage is caused and that you don't cause any damage either. The responsibility becomes his. However, and this is a good question why this is, but when you're baking, okay, maybe because you have to knead and you have to do other actions, some say her arms will be revealed. It's a more immodest action. It requires, I guess, more physical activity. Again, it's hard to imagine baking as an immodest action, but enough so that Kevan Debayi Hitz Niuta, she needs to have privacy in this area, and it's not a modest activity. Therefore, the owner of the house is going to make sure not to be around when she does that. And therefore, the responsibility is going to be on her. Because if the owner's not around, well, someone has to be responsible for these, right? Make sure that the animals don't eat it. It's going to go back to her. So that's our seesaw of who's more responsible than who. And that explains the distinction between these three cases. Case number one was where no responsibility, right? If Ruth wasn't allowed to be there, then of course she didn't accept any responsibility because there was no arrangement made at all. That's why she's not liable. Once there is responsibility, it's going to depend on whether the owner's expected to be there or not expected to be there. And that's the distinction we made. Now we're going to have, so what we did so far, just to review, and then I won't go back and review at the end, we had two sections so far. We had the question of how much liability does Naomi assume when she says, I'll watch your stuff, or when implicitly it's that she'll watch the stuff. And that we didn't really have an answer. We tried to bring two sources, didn't succeed. And now we have this case that we then had to compare to two other cases and try to figure out the distinctions here. Now Rava is going to bring three laws. Two of them are going to be where Ruth brings her ox into Naomi's house, but the case is going to turn into one of bor and not shor. Okay? And then once we move into the world of bor, we're going to get back into all sorts of rules about bor that are good review because we're coming up on bor already starting at the end of tomorrow's daf. So hichnis shoro lechatzar balabayit. Okay, this is based on the wording in the case in the Mishna. Case number, right, there was A, B, and C. We're now in C when Ruth brings an ox in. I'm a Rav. Hichnis shoro lechatzar balabayit shelo bereshut. Now, same case as the Mishnah right now. Then we're going to switch a little. But Ruth brings her ox into Naomi's courtyard without permission. And the ox starts digging and digs holes and ruins the field by digging all these holes, because now, Naomi can't plant till she fills it all in. Obviously, Ruth is going to be liable for the damages caused, but if, now you have to add this, if Naomi basically says my field is going to be hefker and I'm making it ownerless, but she keeps ownership of the boar, again, this depends on who you hold by and whatever, but let's just assume, or she's mafkir the whole thing and makes everything Rishut Rabim, then when she does that and there's all these holes, right? Let's say she says, she ruined my field, now I may as well just make it public property. And then it becomes a boar. Who's liable for damages of the boar? Naomi, not Ruth. Now, why? It's a little bit strange. And in fact, if you're going to say Ruth, well, remember what we learned. Ki ish bor, which means only if a person digs a boar. This is a boar dug by an animal. Usually there is no boar for a boar dug by an animal. So now we're going to see. So Bala shor chayav b'nizkei chatzer, but Bala chatzer chayav b'nizkei bor. Naomi is going to be responsible for the damages of boar. Even though the Torah says, not when a shor digs a pit, but hacha, here, who's responsible for this pit? Well, the shor dug the pit, but then after that, Naomi said, I'm making this property public. And when she did that, there were these open pits in her property. So she becomes responsible because she should have filled them in before she made it public property, because she's creating a hazard now in public property. So even though she didn't dig it, it's like she created it because she created the hazard in the public domain. And she didn't fill it in. It's as if she dug. Paste number 2, that's also going to connect with bor, but in a different way. Amarav, if Ruth brings her ox into Naomi's courtyard and her ox gores the balabayit, or the balabayit trips over, so either the ox does it intentionally or it's just there and the owner didn't notice it and trips over it. And again, this is without permission. Ruth went in, obviously chayav, right? Ruth's going to be liable for damages. Ravatz patur. Now, what does ravatz usually mean? Crouches. If the animal crouched, then Ruth is exempt. Like, let's say the animal crouched, and then Naomi didn't see her, tripped over didn't see him, the ox, trips over the ox, Ruth's exempt. So the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Mishum to ravatz patur. Why? Because the animal crouched. Is all of a sudden Ruth going to be exempt from responsibility? It makes no sense. She brought her ox into Naomi's domain, damaged Naomi. There should be no reason she should be exempt. So Amar, Papa, my ravatz. No, ravatz doesn't mean crouched. Shehir beats, it's using a different form of the word. Here beats kalalim and it's nifu kelav shabalabai. Happened was the animal did its thing and made a mess of all of its feces all over the field. And then Naomi's stuff got dirty from it and ruined from it. Her kelim, okay, her vessels, her clothes got dirtied from it and ruined. Now, why is she not responsible, Ruth? Well, you might remember now, if you leave an obstacle, this is an obstacle in the public domain, that already, now again, shor is going to turn into bor here because it's the feces that came from the shor. To havia glalim bor, these feces are now like leaving, remember, Evan, Sakin, or Masah, you leave a stone, you leave a knife in the middle of the public domain. Now, in this case, she left it in Naomi's domain, but the glalim are bor, v'lo matzinu bor, shachievet hakelim. Once you get into the world of bor, remember, shor v'lo adam, chamor v'lo kelim. If they learn from the pasuk, it says shor or chamor fall into there. A chamor are not vessels. You're not liable for vessels. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, but we're talking about the main opinion. Now, there's one problem with calling this bor, if you remember, and it's going to depend on whether you hold by Rabbi Shmuel. So we're doing a big review before we get to this straight on. But, and like I said, the next few dapim, we're going to be all about bor. Shmuel says, even if I own it, it's still, right, because this is Ruth's stuff in Naomi's property. Ruth owns the animal, and then the animal drops the feces on the ground. Those feces are theoretically owned by Ruth. So if you say, like Shmuel, that any obstacle you leave, even if you accept ownership over it, right? Rav says if it's yours, it's a din of shor. That means you would be liable for killing. Shmuel says, no, any obstacle you leave is a din of bor. Anything that's not moving and causes damage, right, is bor, according to Shmuel. So then it makes sense. This is bor. But Rav says only if you make it ownerless. And she make it ownerless, it came from her shor. So what do you mean it should make it ownerless? Amre, of course she did. Stam galim, of course, Ruth didn't want the feces. She obviously, once it came out of the animal, she said, oh, I don't want this anymore. And it was classic boar. Okay, but that answer, we're not going to be able to give in the next time we have this. So remember that. Okay, that's going to come up later in the daf where they're going to have the exact same line of questioning. How could you call this boar? And then they're not going to be able to say, because in that case, there was no hefker, and we're going to have to explain it some other way according to Rav. Like I said, this daf is going to kind of keep going back to similar things, but from different, kind of comes at it from different ways. Now we're in the third halacha of Rava, and this one actually doesn't have to do with boar. This is now moving the same case of Ruth and Naomi, but instead of their items damaging each other, we're now going to talk about them damaging each other. So, Amar Nichnas, so basically humans causing damage and not their objects. Nichnas l'chatzer balabayit shelo b'reshut. V'yizikit balabayit. Ruth walks into Naomi's house, punches her in the face, okay, without permission. Oh, balabayit huzakbo, or Ruth is there and Naomi trips over Ruth, okay? Not that she did it, Ruth did it on purpose. Either which way, chayav, because remember, Ruth's liable for damages whether she intended them or didn't intend them. Kiziko balabayit, but if Naomi punches Ruth, patur, she's not liable to pay any damages. Why not? Well, we're going to talk about this. Not so clear cut. But right now we assume because Ruth had no permission being there. So sounds like Naomi could do whatever she wants. Papa, wait a minute. Lo maran ela de lo have a yadabe. If she injures Ruth because she didn't know she was there, and maybe because of that she injured her, not purposely, but kind of didn't even know she was there, and therefore, opened her door, smashed into her without knowing there was, if there's maybe someone going to be there, you're careful when you open your door. She didn't think anybody was there. She had no idea. She smashed the door, hit Ruth in the face, gave her some big injury. But havayadabe, he's a kobal abayit. But if Naomi knew that Ruth was there, even without permission, she can't hit her. My time, why not? Ruth can say, listen, Naomi, I know you don't want me in your house, so you can kick me out, but you can't beat me up. Now, by the way, this a little bit sounds reminiscent of the sugya of, can you take the law into your own hands? Can you beat someone up, knock out their teeth, right, if they're not getting out? So maybe that's what's going on here, but it's not even clear if our Papa disagrees with Rava or he's really just explaining Rava. It sounds like he's saying, oh, by the way, Rava really meant this, okay? And that really, you can't just start beating her up because she happens to be in your house. Now they point out, going back to the original law, which is if Ruth has no rights being there, then Naomi, she gets damaged somehow by Naomi, maybe not on purpose, because on purpose maybe she can't, but by accident, yes. So that's going to be the responsibility. Again, if Ruth damages Naomi, Ruth is responsible. If Naomi damages, she's not responsible. So Adu the Tamayu. So this statement of Rava and then Rav Papa, who modified it, but really Rav Papa agrees with the basic law, sticks perfectly. It's consistent with their approach somewhere else, because either Rava, V'item or Rav Papa, there's a debate about who said it, but one of them made this statement, which fits together with it, moving out of Amubet, Shnehem bereshut or Shnehem shelo bereshut. If both have permission to be in a certain place, okay, like let's say it's a public domain and they can both be there. Hiziku zed zeh chayavim. If they intentionally punch the other one, they're liable. But who's kuzeh bazeh? But if they accidentally injured, since they both have permission to be there, they're both exempt. Or either one is exempt, right? If one accidentally damaged the other. Because again, now, even though you're liable for accidental damage, in this case, if both have permission and they bumped into each other, and one got hurt, it's not the fault of one over the other. Because again, even though you're always liable, if someone's as equally liable as you, then no. Tama, now, what can you infer from the statement of theirs? That the reason here why you're both exempt is because the shneim bereshut or shneim shelo bereshut. In other words, if you have permission to be there or you don't have, if both are on equal grounds, either both can be there or both are not allowed to be there. If they're both trespassing in someone else's property, I forgot to mention that. That's what it said before. Either they both could be there or they both were not allowed to be there. They're both in someone else's property and damaged each other by accident. So they're going to each be exempt. Aval, what can you infer from there, though? If it's not even, that was our case, Ruth is not allowed to be there and Naomi's allowed to be there because it's Naomi's house, then it would be imbalanced. And we wouldn't say they're both liable if they damage on purpose and they're both not liable if they damage accidentally. No, we're going to say the one who's not allowed to be there is always going to be liable, and the one who's not allowed, who is allowed to be there, is never going to be responsible. So those were three halachot that Rav said. Again, two kind of we're dealing with, then shor becomes the bor, and the third one was talking about adam hamasik and not your property damage. Now we're going to go back to the Mishna. We're in the third section where we're talking about a shor. And now there's all sorts of other cases that come up about this shor. So Ruth's shor goes into Naomi's field. And another thing that could happen is nafal lebol v'hibi'ish meimav. If she falls into the pit, and let's say her body's filthy, and she ruins the water from all the filth that's on her body, so Ruth is going to be liable again. Amar Rava lo shanu ela shevi'ish b'shat nefilah. By the way, it depends how she got it dirty. If the body of the animal was filthy and fell into the bore and dirtied the waters right away as it was falling, then yes, that would be damages of shor. But la'achar nefilah, if let's say the animal falls in and dies, and over time, what happens? A stench comes out of there, ruins the water. That's already damages of bore because that's something not moving, right? That causes damage. So my time, and then you're not going to be liable for ruining the water. Why not? Because have a shor bore. The shor becomes damages of bore in this case because it's not moving anymore. And mayim is kelim. Water is treated like a vessel. Okay, if you have to put it in some category, it's not in the animal category, it's not in the human category, it's more in the vessel category. And what did we learn? Lo matzinu bor about kelim. And like we said before, bor is not chayav in kelim. But this is where we're going to go back to that sugya again. Now, this is going to work for Shmuel, who says, even if I own it, it's still bore because, right, any obstacle I put, and here's an obstacle that's not moving, and it's still owned by me. Now, here's the tricky part. You can't say he was mafkir like the feces because you're not mafkir this. This is his animal, right? Ruth was not saying, I disown my animal now. Of course, she wants the nevela. It's worth something. And it's still hers. So, according to Shmuel, who says kol takala is bore, it makes perfect sense. But Rav says only if you made it ownerless. How are you going to explain it then? This isn't ownerless. So how could you call it bore? If it's not bore, it's shor. If the shor is causing damages, you are going to be liable for the damage to the water because shor is liable for even vessels. So Ela'id Mar Hachidra, they basically say, can't be Rava said that, then we're going to so forget Rava who said, oh, it's only shat nefilah, but after nefilah, it's bore and you're exempt. No. That can't be true because it doesn't work according to Rav. But ela'it mar hachitma. This is the way it should read. Amar Rava, lo shanu ele shevi'ish migufo. If, as the shor falls in, the body of the shor causes this terrible stench and ruins the water, like from bacteria or something like that, aval hivi'ish merecho patur. But if over time the animal dies and then the stench comes out and the stench is what ruins it, then he's exempt. So this sounds similar, but it's different. Why? Because it's not shat nefilah versus this and whether it's bore or not. It's all shor. But my taima, why are you going to be exempt if it comes out of the body later? Because it's grama, right? This causes that. The animal fell in, and then the animal started having the stench, and then that stench ruined the water. That's already indirect damages. So we call that grama ba'almahu. It's only indirect. And grama ba'alma lo mechayev, and you're not liable for grama. So it is damages of shor, or it could be explained as damages of shor and not bore. But the reason you're exempt is not because it's bore, and bore is exempt for kelim, vessels, which is the water. No, it's because it's indirect damages, and that's what Rava said. Okay, so we reread Rava because Rava made no sense in the first reading, according to Rava anyway, which is interesting because we actually hold like Shmuel. So you could theoretically say that Rava is just saying according to Shmuel, but the Gemara prefers always to kind of fit him in with all the approaches if they can. Now we're going to have a bit of a problem with this case. If the shor falls into the bore, and in the bore, so again, Ruth's ox is in Naomi's property. In the bottom of the bore is Naomi's father or brother, and Naomi's ox falls on them and kills them. So what do we say? Ruth has to pay, right? I hope I said it right. Ruth's animal falls in, and Ruth has to pay the kofer for killing them. Now, when do you pay kofer? Remember, if it's a shor, muad. Now, unless otherwise stated, we assume when it says shor, it means a shor tam. That's the usual assumption. So, amai, ha tamu, and tam doesn't pay kofer. Well, you might remember, Rabbi Yosi haGelili says tam pays chatzi kofer. We'll get back to that. But right now, they're going to assume tam doesn't pay kofer. That's the main opinion. So why would you have to pay kofer here? So we're going to have three answers. First answer, amarav, b'muad li pola b'nei adam b'bolo. It was a shor muad. What's it muad about? It fell 3 times into a pit onto a person and killed them. Okay, well, and that askinan, right? That's the case. There's a big problem with this case. Ihachi bar katalu. If it already killed a person 3 times, the shor should be dead by now. What's the shor doing being alive? So, Amar Rabbi Yosef, the Chaza Yeroka Unafal. It was a case where the shor isn't liable to die. Why not? Why don't they die? Because each time it did it, it saw some greenery next to the boar. We saw this case before. And it went to go eat it, fell into the boar, killed a person. So they did the same thing 3 times. They became muad for that action of falling into a boar and killing someone, but they wouldn't get the death penalty because they didn't intend to kill a person. So because of that, they're not bar katala. So we could have a case of a muad that would work, and that would explain it. But Shmuel gives a different reason. Amar Hamane, Rabbi Yosi haGelili, Damar, Tama Shalem Chatzi Kofer. Now here we have the opposite of what we had before. Before we had a case where someone said they were exempt, and we exempt meant not having to pay full, but pays half. Now we're taking chayav and saying chayav only means half damages, right? Half kofer. So we're going to say chayav means, oh, well, it was a short time, but it's Rabbi Yosi haGelili who says, if it's a short time, you pay half the kofer. So yeah, you have to pay kofer, but obviously only half kofer because it's a short time. Ula kind of fixes this. He gives a third option where you could get to full damages even according to Rabbi Yosi haGelili and a short time. How so? Ula amar Rabbi Yosi haGelili, but also the amar ke Rabbi Tarfon. Because what did Rabbi Tarfon say? And again, this daf connects all sorts of things we've been learning. Karen b'chatzar anizak nezek shalem meshalem. Remember, he says if it's in the house of the one who's you damaged, then you actually Karen damages have to pay full damages. Now we have to make a jump. We're not talking about damages here. We're talking about kofer. But hachinami kofer shalem mishalem. So if you take Rabbi Yosi haGelili that there is a kofer payment for a short time, and then you say, or for Karen damages, and then you say, well, Karen in the chatzar anizak pays full damages, then you would also say pays full kofer, even though it's only a short time. So now they just want to do a side thing about this. Ula makes perfect sense because it's only going to work in chatzar anizak, where you're going to have to pay full damages, full kofer. Because again, he thinks kofer would have to mean full kofer and not half kofer. Then it would make sense, if it's chatzar anizak, it would have to be Naomi's father or Naomi's brother, because it would have to be someone related to her. Otherwise, the damages are going to someone who it's not even their property, and then you wouldn't have this problem. You wouldn't pay full damages. But according to Shmuel, and actually according to Rava also, both the other interpretations would have no bearing whether it was Naomi's father or brother, or whether it was some random person in the boar. In the end, the shor caused damages, killed somebody, they'd be liable. So they say, yeah, that shouldn't bother you. Orche demilta katani. Who's normally going to be? I mean, whether anyone will be in the bottom of a pit is a good question why they were there in the first place. But if someone's going to be at the bottom of a pit, Naomi's property, chances are it's her father or brother. So they just took an example that was a typical case, but not that it really means only that case. Now we're going to bring the psak halacha going all the way back to yesterday, where we have this machloket Kamma and Rebbe about if Naomi says you can bring your stuff in, does it mean I'm accepting full responsibility, or only if she says I'm accepting full responsibility is she accepting responsibility? So itma Rava mar hilchataka Kamma u'Shmuel mar hilchataka Rebbe. So we have machloket Rav and Shmuel who we hold by. Rav says it's automatic. When she says yes, come in, it means yes, and Shmuel says no, it's not automatic, that she's taking responsibility. Now we're going to have a braita. Tanu Rabbanit. Knos shocha ushmaro, hizik chayav huzak patur. This is going to be pretty basic. If Naomi says, bring in your shor to Ruth, but you watch it, then what happens? Who's responsible? Obviously, Ruth, because Naomi said, but you watch it. Hizik chayav huzak patur. If Ruth's ox damages, Ruth is liable. If Ruth's ox gets damaged, Naomi doesn't have to pay because she told Ruth all the responsibilities on you. But if Naomi says, but she says, and I'll watch it, huzak chayav hizik patur. The opposite is true. Then all of a sudden, Naomi accepts all responsibility. So if Ruth's animal gets damaged, Naomi's going to have to pay. If Ruth's ox damages, then Ruth, right? Then Naomi, then Ruth is going to be exempt, right? In this case, right? Huzak chayav, right? She'll have to pay her, and hizik, right? Ruth will be exempt because she didn't accept damages. So now, hagu fakasha. This whole braita is got a contradiction. Now, it's not really that it contradicts, so it actually makes a lot of sense. But what's the problem? Each one assumes if I said this, I said I won't watch, or I said I will watch, right? Naomi says I will watch, I won't watch. What each case implies, though, what if I didn't say anything? So the first case implies the opposite of what the second case does, because it sounds like if Naomi says I won't watch, then it means if I didn't say anything, it means I will watch. And if she says specifically, I will watch, that's when she accepts responsibility. But it sounds, according to the second part, But if she didn't say anything, it sounds like she's not accepting responsibility, only because she says, I will watch. So the first part sounds like the rabbis, and the second part sounds like Rabbi. So that's what the Gemara is going to say here. That if you say and you watch it, Naomi's not going to have any responsibility. It sounds like because she said and you watch it, right? The owner of the ox is responsible and not Naomi. Hastama, but if she didn't say anything, it would sound like that it would flip, and Naomi would be responsible. That, right? If you don't say anything, the assumption is, and that's the rabbi's opinion, the Tanakh and the Mishna, that you'd be accepting responsibility. Naomi, by saying, bring it in, accepts responsibility. However, from the Seifa, this is just reviewing what I just said. The Seifa says, right? Because she says, I will watch it, that makes her responsible for the damages. But if she didn't say, I will watch it, she wouldn't be. Hastama, chayav bala shor, patur bala chatzer. Debistama lo makabel any tuta. If she didn't say anything, it would sound implied from case number 2 is that Ruth would still remain obligated. And that's Atan the Rebbe, who says, Ad shekabel eleni tiruta bala shor, bala bayit lishmo. That, you're not responsible until you say, oh yes, and I'll watch it. But just saying, bring it into my property doesn't mean anything. So Reisha Rabbanan v'Sefer Rebbe, how could that be? So we're going to have 3 answers. Amalei Rabbi Elazar, and with that we'll finish for today. Tavla, break the source in half. Misha shanazo, lo shanazo. Okay, yes. First case is Rabbanan, second case is Rebbe. Rava Amar, Kula Rabbanani. Rava says, what are you talking about? It's all the rabbis. It's all assumed that, if you don't say anything, you're responsible. But I did Dinasav Resha Shmarao, Tanasefa, Anish Morenu, just for literary parallelism. Okay, they just wanted to make the first case parallel to the second case parallel to the first. The first case is really the case to go by. If she says, but Ruth, you watch it, then she's not going to be responsible. But Stam, she would be. The other case just gave the flip, the inverse case. Okay, but it doesn't mean that you can infer anything from there. That's really the simplest answer. Rav Papa Amar, with this will end, Kula Rebbe. Rabbi Tarfon. We're getting back to Rabbi Tarfon. I told you, we're going to keep coming full circle here. So the whole thing is really Rebbe. The minastam, you don't accept achrayut. So now we have to explain the first case. Why, when she says to Ruth, watch it, is Ruth going to be responsible, but otherwise not? So Savar Rabbi Tarfon Da'amal, Karen b'chatzar anizak nezek shalem mishalem. Hilkach. Now here comes this goes back to things we learned today already. Amalei shmaro, if she says, Ruth, you watch it, lo machne lemakom b'chatzir, which she's really saying is, you can keep your thing here, but I'm not giving you anything. I'm not sharing my domain with you. Remember we said, as soon as she says, bring it in here, she's basically saying, I'm sharing my domain with you. By saying, but you're in charge to watch, she basically means, I'm not sharing my domain with you, which means that Havile Karen b'chatzer hanizak, and it's Rabbi Tarfon. So this becomes Karen b'chatzer hanizak. If it's Karen b'chatzer hanizak, right? Because Ruth doesn't belong there. Her ox is doing damage in someone else's field because she doesn't have any rights to, right? She has rights to leave her shore there, but she doesn't have rights to the property at all because she said, you watch it. So Karen b'chatzer hanizak, mishalim nezem shalem. Now we're going to do again the same thing we did last time, which is chayav means full damages. And when we assume she'll be patur, though, if she didn't say anything, right? So then, lo amar le shmaro, then Ruth will not be liable. Why? Well, if they're both owners of the property, then it's like Reshut HaRabim, basically. And then if Ruth's ox, if she basically, the other case, right, the inference is, but if she didn't say, and you watch it, then basically she said, you have rights to be in my field and you basically share ownership, which means that if now Ruth's ox causes damages, if it's Rebbe, then it means Naomi didn't take responsibility for the ox. So Ruth will have to pay, but it'll only be half damages. So again, patur is going to mean not patur entirely, but only pay half damages. And then that explains, it's another third explanation of how to understand the contradiction in the Bright. Okay, so what we did today, again, we're not going back to the beginning, so I reviewed that, but then we went to these 3 halachot of Rava, 2 having to do with bor, 1 having to do with Adam, and then we went to the nafal lebor vivish meimav, Rava's explanation of it, but then we said, oh, that's not right, we gave a different explanation for it. Then we went to the avivu beno, how could that be? Why would they pay kofer if it's a short time? Either it's a shor muad, or it's a short time, but there is a kofer payment because Rabbi Yosi haGelili, and then it would either be half or whole, depending on the 2 interpretations that we saw. right? Whether it also goes by Rabbi Tarfon or not. Then we had this psak, like Rebbe or like the rabbis, and then we brought a braita that seemed to do a split, Rebbe and the rabbis, and we gave 3 ways of explaining that source. Either it really is a split, or it's all Rabbanit, or it's all Rebbe, and that was where we ended. That's it for today. We'll start with the new Mishna tomorrow. Wishing everybody a good day.